It's common practice to start every review of every utterance about short stories by saying they are an overlooked genre. Seldom commercially successful, they live in the shadow of big fat novels, they're even excluded from certain literary awards, it's unfair and blah blah blah. With those preliminaries now out of the way, we can talk about two short story collections, Madame Zero by Sarah Hall and Room Little Darker by June Caldwell. Both were published in 2017 and are now available in paperback, both dirt cheap by the way. I wasn't impressed by the first short story in Madame Zero. Mrs. Fox won the BBC National Short Story Award in 2013, and there are flashes of excitement in this story about a woman who turns into a fox, seen through the unbelieving eyes of her husband. It's interesting, but it's limited. The surprise for me came with the second short story about a psychologist trying to help a young boy who grew up in a commune and ended up without a sense of self. And then the third story takes us into a Margaret Atwood Handmaid's Tale-like world where an anaesthetist has to handle a case of what is euphemistically called a pre-birth crisis involving a pregnant woman. The government has recently issued new laws protecting unborn life, and the mother's life is deemed far less important. At this point, any reader will have noticed how different these stories are, and it goes on like that. Every story putting us in a completely new context. Some of those are realist, but Sarah Hall doesn't shy away from some popular culture either. In later His Ghost, the world has been destroyed by a violent storm still raging, and one man goes into the storm looking for a copy of Hamlet for his companion to read. Like many stories in this collection, this one is about identity, about the very center of what makes a person that particular person. The other common denominator here is suspense. Hall has a knack for injecting suspense in just about any situation. The crossing of a wobbly bridge in the story Wilderness is way more exciting than it ought to be, and I absolutely love the story Luxury Hour, about a woman who is going for a swim, the one moment a week she is without her baby. She runs into an old friend, and only gradually do we understand the sudden tension, the uneasiness. We start to understand that this man may actually be the father of her child. The baby was a complication, but she could tell him what the child's name was at least. If nothing else, he should know that. They could exchange phone numbers. They could meet somewhere between Brighton and here, or she could just watch him through the cafe window from the corner table, a woman from the past. She could watch him swim, his body a long shadow under the surface. Sarah Hall already published several novels, but for June Caldwell, Room Little Darker is her debut. According to Spiked, it is probably the most important Irish short story collection since Dubliners, which is quite a statement. But what cannot be denied is that Room Little Darker is extreme. The world of June Caldwell is full of alcoholism and drug addiction, violence against drug addicts, violence against taxi drivers, violence against the homeless, violence against family members. And even when that violence is invited, as in the case of the S&M couple in the story Lightroom Flip, Caldwell finds a way to kick it up a notch and make it unpleasant. Violence against language as well. In many of these stories, Caldwell uses a staccato style full of street lingo, weird expressions and lightning-quick associations. Nobby's high-rise flat in East London, and there's a gun on the table. Man in it is all I can make out. Reggae tunes, loud and demanding, too much Barney Rubble, ain't it Mork and Mindy out. Cunts, cunts, cunts. One of his cronies wiping coke snot from his hooter, rubbing runways of slick onto a gnarled hand. Fear ferreting up my legs so quick I have to step out onto the balcony to glare at half-lit office blocks with tiny security men anting around inside. I'm shaking. Caldwell's stories are bleak, but they would be even bleaker if the language was more resigned, less alive, less on and on and on. So it serves a purpose, but I did find myself leafing back in almost every story. You know, you start reading, then you go back to the first page, you read it again, you read a bit further, you read it again, and then slowly it starts to cohere into a story, and I'm not always convinced it was worth my while. How many times do you want to start over reading a story about a drug addict who smuggles drugs up his anus and gets robbed in a quite unpleasant way? It's interesting how both Hall and Caldwell clearly try to shock their audience. Room Little Darker has a story about a pedophile using a boy robot to satisfy his urges. And I understand why this story is put near the end of the book, because by that time you've become so numb to all the violence and filth that you need something as shocking as Boybot TM to still tickle a nerve. Also, in this respect, I find Hall the more subtle of the two writers. She ends her book with a story that mirrors the first one, Mrs. Fox. In Evie, a woman undergoes some sudden changes, making her scarily horny, and her husband tries to keep up with her, but when in the end we know what's been going on, we realize how much damage he's done with the best intentions. Now that is painful. June Caldwell's writing is very in your face, whereas what happens in the stories of Sarah Hall is always just out of sight, like that long shadow under the surface of the water. On the whole, I find that there is a lot to be admired, but not quite as much to be enjoyed in June Caldwell's stylistically daunting gore fest. It's more an exercise in extremism, whereas Sarah Hall uses extreme story ideas to investigate what is essential, what really matters in a life. Kyle, do you have anything to add about these books?
It would seem Hall and Caldwell are very different writers, meant for different readers, but they both produce instances of beauty, according to the definition of Thomas of Aquino. He said, the three things requisite for beauty are integrity, wholeness, symmetry, and variance.
Yes, of course. Thomas of Aquino, fascinating. Isn't that four things?